developed by Real Time Worlds and released in 2007. Today, we're heading back to Pacific City to violently pacify some out-of-control gangs. Along the way, we'll collect weapons, cars, and ability orbs to level up our superhero character and help create an oppressive police state. I bought Crackdown in 2007 for my Xbox 360, and I bought it for one reason. It came with an access key to the Halo 3 online beta. Fortunately for Microsoft, Crackdown turned out to be a decent and well-received game that people could turn to when the Halo 3 beta had ended. Let's talk about the game itself. It's a distinctive and bombastic open-world action game that, despite its age, is fun to play. Crackdown has a particular visual identity, which is comprised of its cell shading, blocky characters, chunky cars, and a looming cityscape. You are an agent, belonging to the Agency, which is the central security force for Pacific City. Each zone of Pacific City feels different, and the three gangs that you are trying to dismantle have their own vehicles, weapons, and hideouts that set them apart from each other. Likewise, the agent that you play as, their weapons and their vehicles, are futuristic and at home in the advanced Agency Tower in the city's centre. The weakest part of Crackdown's visual presentation is unfortunately the explosion effects. The physics and the gameplay chaos of explosions is super, but the actual munition ignition and impact is a little bit lackluster compared to some of the other effects in the game. Like the visual elements of the presentation, audio is strong overall with a few weak spots. Cars, especially agency vehicles, sound great. When you are leaping around the city, the soundscape will shift and bring life to areas that would be otherwise barren. As you're climbing buildings, for example, you'll hear muffled music, the sounds of televisions, and the distant whoosh of traffic below. Little touches like that help Pacific City feel alive. The soundtrack is, in my opinion, fairly average. There's a huge selection of independent, largely electronic tracks, but nothing that really clicked with me, or had stuck with me since playing it back in 2007. Good on Crackdown for going after unknown independent artists and having a cohesive musical through line, but it still doesn't compare with being able to go back to Saints Row or Grand Theft Auto and remember my favourite in-game radio stations. The centrepiece of the audio in Crackdown is definitely the voice work by Michael McConaughey, who plays the agency director. His narration, commentary on your actions, and tone throughout the game are critical to the Crackdown experience.
It's all gone to shit, and it just keeps rising. Now it's about to hit the fan.
I'm going to put him up there with such greats as the Halo multiplayer announcer or the narrators in the Stanley Parable and Bastion. This is a guy with charisma and gravitas, and he has an impact on your experience and how you feel when you're playing the game. I can't give higher praise than that.
You might want to bulk up some more before trying to handle something as heavy as that.
As far as the gameplay itself goes, it's a mixed bag. The structure of having 3 zones and 3 gangs to destroy is simple and satisfying. You work your way through underbosses in order to weaken and eventually eliminate each area's kingpin. Your arsenal is a surprisingly plain mix of conventional weapons, although the explosive launchers and the grenade variety injects a fair bit of fun. Aiming is just okay. Trying to shoot anything without locking on feels futile, given how much you run and jump around. The lock-on system has body-specific targeting options that alters how quickly and accurately you can engage. There's a good trade-off where headshots do more damage, but you take longer to zero in compared to aiming for the chest. Locking on works most of the time, but is occasionally frustrating. You will sometimes lock onto the car that the enemy is standing behind, and the reticule will hold and sometimes snap onto enemies that you have just killed. Early on, agency vehicles feel great, and civilian cars mostly handle like crap. Driving is fun, however, and there are races and stunt jumps to find across the city. You can tell that Crackdown was made by one of the original creators of GTA. It's got all these nice little design elements, and everything generally blends pretty well together and works to a decent standard.
That's the spirit.
Platforming is decent, for example. You can grab ledges and have a fair bit of directional control when you're in the air, which is helpful as you parkour about the place. Sometimes your character does feel like they have sticky feet, particularly when they're moving around on narrow obstacles. Fortunately, driving, shooting, exploding, jumping, and other skills can all be leveled up and improved. Agility is leveled up by collecting orbs dotted across the skyline. Most other areas are leveled up by actually using the relevant skill in combat. Collecting orbs makes a meaningful difference because every level you go up increases your proficiency in areas like jump height, overall strength, and targeting speed. It's a simple, uncomplicated, rewarding progression system. If I had to describe the overall gameplay experience, I'd call it serviceable. Nothing is incredible, but everything works well enough, and having enough variety across systems means that you're never stuck doing one thing for too long. Overall, the game handles better than I thought it would too. There's a toy box feel to being able to jump around the city, cleaning up the gangs, and occasionally playing with vehicles and new weapons. While it isn't a revelation, Crackdown is impressive because it did the basics well and was early to the open world action superhero party. In the years following Crackdown, we would have the infamous series, Prototype, Batman Arkham City and Knight, and more Just Cause games. Crackdown is a punchy little game that deserves some extra recognition for going one further than the games that followed it. You could visit Pacific City with a friend online. That was a big deal in 2007, and not something many open world action games would be able to follow with for many years. Crackdown had 2 sequels, but I'm not planning to revisit either of them. Crackdown is a bit like Dead Rising. It's a series where the first game had an original premise and setting, something to say thematically, and then the sequels gave up on all of that in order to recycle the setting alone and make slight improvements to gameplay. Disappointing sequels, basically. That said, I think the first one is still worth your time. To conclude, in my reviews, I don't give scores or tell everyone to buy or replay a game. Here are my qualified recommendations for Crackdown. If you like open world action superhero games, I recommend Crackdown. For an early game of its type, its presentation and its tone still resonate. Its core systems are decent, and replaying it is fun. All of those points are achievements for a game that's 15 years old. If you're nostalgic for Crackdown and played it when it came out, it gets a recommend for those same reasons. It holds up better than I anticipated it would. For everyone else, if you like what you've seen and heard today, it gets a soft recommend. I had fun revisiting Pacific City and was taken by Crackdown's straightforward gameplay and weirdly political undertone. There's nothing quite like it, even today. Thanks for listening. Take care.